So I, 23F, have been with my husband, 29M, for 3 years and we were supposed to get married a few days back. It didn't happen the way I wanted it to because my psycho mom pulled some really messed up crap which ended up sending me to the hospital with a crazy allergic reaction. She swapped out my floral arrangement of only orchids and peonies for a bunch of daisies, dahlias, and irises. I have a severe pollen allergy and also asthma, so it's really bad for me to be around pollen-heavy flowers, which all of the ones I mentioned above are. And the wedding venue was loaded with those flowers which drove me nuts and triggered an asthma attack so bad that I had to go to the ER, all thanks to my mom. For context, my mother, 44F, and I don't get along, as you all might have concluded by now. Growing up, my parents lived separately for a while and I got used to that. They had a lot of differences back then, so they separated when I was 7, but they ended up getting back together when I was 15 or so. Just so we're clear, my parents were never divorced and were still married on paper, but they lived separately and lived separate lives. I visited my mother every other weekend, but she'd never have time to spare for me and I'd end up spending most of my time by myself in my room at her place. So that was my relationship with my mom, and it was strained at best, but we were on okay terms. She did see other men when she was separated from my dad, but I don't know if those guys knew about her marriage beforehand and I never asked. As far as my dad is concerned, he never brought home any women, and even if he did see other women, I didn't get to know about it. They remained on good terms even while they were separated, since they'd parted mutually and so co-parented me to the best of their abilities. Or, well, at least my dad tried to. My mother wasn't very keen on parenting me at all. I'm over it, though, and I didn't try to reconnect with her or fix my relationship with her after I left for college because I got too busy. College is also where I met my husband, and no, he wasn't a student there. I became friends with his sister during college, and 1 year, I had to stay back during Thanksgiving since I couldn't fly back home due to a blizzard. My friend lived nearby, so she decided to invite me to her house for Thanksgiving dinner, and that's where I met my husband for the first time. I was 19 at the time and he was 25, so I thought the age gap was a little weird, and I guess so did he, but neither of us did anything about it. But we did become friends and kept in touch. We'd speak to each other almost daily for a couple of months and even hung out a few times. After that, there was just no denying that we had a thing, but he was really shy and didn't ask me out, so I decided to ask him out instead, and it was really sweet. He ended up saying yes and we started dating. After I graduated, I moved in with him, and about 6 months later, we decided that it was time to tell our families about us. I already knew his family and they seemed to like me. I was hesitant to introduce him to mine, though. I was cool with my dad, but I didn't want to introduce him to my mom because I just had a gut feeling that something would go wrong if I did. I didn't even know it back then, but yeah, I was right. I did end up bringing him home to meet my parents during the holidays nevertheless, and back then, I believed that it had gone well. I didn't notice that my mother had been really quiet during the whole thing and had been actively avoiding looking at either of us. I was just glad she wasn't saying weird crap about me or making backhanded jokes about me like she usually does. He only met my family a couple of times after that, and I didn't notice anything off at the time, so I had no idea about what my mother was thinking then. 7 months ago, my husband proposed and I said yes. My parents flew down here to be able to attend the wedding 4 weeks ago as a surprise. I was happy about my dad being here, but not too thrilled that my mom was here too, because all she did was nitpick my choices and try to bring me down. I wanted to send her home without any reason, but I didn't, because then my dad would leave with her, and I didn't want that because then my wedding day would be really sad for me. My dad wasn't exactly aware of the Cold War between my mother and me, and I didn't want to tell him about it either because that would just lead to a load of unnecessary drama, because he'd want me to confront the issue and try to sort it out with her, which I just really didn't want to do. So I put up with her just for my dad's sake, and in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have. For my own and my dad's sake. I'd finalized my florist and floral arrangements and decorations for the wedding about 2 months ago, and incidentally, my mother found out from a list that I'd left on my desk that she happened to be friends with my florist. She'd been visiting my husband and me, which they'd been doing often ever since she and my dad came by, but I didn't think much of it. I just figured that they were visiting us almost every other day before the wedding because I've been living away from home for a really long time, and I guess that my dad just wanted to see me more often, which is why they were visiting us so much before the wedding. I didn't find out that it was actually my mother's idea until yesterday, when I finally told my dad about my issues with my mother. Now, finally, it is the wedding day. 3 days ago, I was supposed to get married, but like I already said, I ended up in the hospital because my mother had swapped the hypoallergenic flowers I'd picked for my wedding for a bunch of pollen-heavy flowers. It triggered my asthma and I landed up in the hospital for the day, which obviously meant that I had to delay the wedding. It wasn't even just a couple of flowers, but the whole place was teeming with them, which is why it became incredibly difficult for me to even breathe there. My husband and I had visited the venue in the morning to check how the decorations were coming along, right before we went to our separate rooms in the hotel to get dressed, and they were still doing up the place, but they'd already made the floral arch and done the flowers, and I realized instantly that these were not the ones that I'd approved. As soon as I went inside, I started sneezing and coughing like crazy, and unfortunately, I'd forgotten my inhaler in the car, so it just got worse by the time my husband arrived with it, and I had to be driven to the ER because my lungs literally felt like they were closing in on themselves. I had only an hour to spare and the doctors said that I'd be fine, but I could not be back in the venue until it had been properly rid of all the flowers and traces of pollen, which would definitely take a while. We had no time to waste since we were already running pretty late and I really didn't want to keep my guests waiting. So I sent my husband back to deal with that while I stayed in the hospital, waiting for my lungs to feel normal. I drove myself to the hotel so I could sit in my room with my bridesmaids and get my makeup done, at least because I was already running an hour late for the wedding. I'd realized on my drive that there had been no news from my husband after he'd left, so I tried to call him but he didn't answer, and neither did any of my family. It was only while I was getting my makeup done that I received a call from my mother-in-law, telling me to come to her room immediately, saying that there was a family emergency that I needed to deal with urgently. So I rushed to her room and found my husband, my dad, my mother, and my mother-in-law sitting in the room. Everyone, with the exception of my mom, looked really disturbed, but she looked quite okay. There, I was told by my mother-in-law that while I was in the hospital, my mother had pulled my husband aside at the venue while they were all trying to speed up the process of clearing out and cleaning the place to get rid of the pollen and tried to make a move on him.
For a second, I couldn't even believe what my mother-in-law was telling me, and I looked at my husband for confirmation.
When he nodded, I realized that this wasn't just some massive prank on me and they were all actually serious about this. My mother-in-law continued speaking and told me that she'd caught her in the act and had actually overheard my mother talking to my husband. It still makes my skin crawl to even think about that, and it's really difficult even typing it out for everyone to know, but I know I have to say it now. So my mother had told my husband that she'd always sensed the tension between them, and now that I was finally out of the picture, they could now get together for real instead of trying to push their feelings down. My husband tried to get away, obviously, but my mother insisted that she knew they had a thing and didn't want to waste the potential of what could have been. Luckily, my mother-in-law was there and she confronted my mother and even dragged her away from her son. That ended with a nasty argument between my mother and my mother-in-law at the venue. That had gone on for a while, which is why nobody had answered my calls. My husband finally had the sense to suggest that everyone be brought to the hotel instead of creating a scene in public in front of all the staff at the venue, which is what they did. And now, they were here to ask me what I wanted to do about this situation since it was our wedding. I didn't even think twice before telling my mother to get up, pack her bags, and leave right then. My mother didn't argue either, and neither did she look back at my dad to ask him to come along, which was surprising because she'd literally just tried to cheat on him with her daughter's fiancé on her wedding day. I also realized that she must have spoken to my florist and changed the order for my wedding, and the florist must have done it because they were friends. When I spoke to the vendor, she told me that she'd received a call from me a couple of weeks back with a request to change the order and a proper discussion about what I wanted, which is why she'd done so. I'm guessing my mother must have gotten a hold of my phone and made the call while I wasn't in the room, because I do have a tendency to forget things. And my voice is similar to hers. A lot of people get confused on the phone, including my dad. Anyway, my mother left, and even though it was a really tense and awful morning, my husband and I did end up getting married. The ceremony started an hour later than it was supposed to, and it was kind of embarrassing, but it was still beautiful. Even though there were absolutely zero flowers there, my husband had doubled up on the balloon last minute and made it livelier, which was a genius move on his part, I just say. That was a couple of days back, and I didn't address the thing about my mother for a while because as a newlywed, I just wanted to enjoy the first few days of my marriage instead of letting my mother's craziness ruin it for me. But yesterday, my dad finally visited and we talked about what happened. We hadn't spoken much after my mother left, and I didn't have enough time to speak to him at the wedding, even though he did walk me down the aisle. He'd stayed here at the hotel, but he's supposed to leave today, which is why he paid me a visit last evening. It was awkward, but he did tell me that he hadn't spoken to my mother since she left and truly didn't know what to expect. I told him all about the issues I had with her, and he seemed really surprised because he had never picked up on any of it. It wasn't surprising because my dad had always been sort of oblivious when it came to social cues and stuff like that, so I forgive him for never noticing the tension between my mother and me. However, I did tell him that I'd put up with her long enough for his sake only, and now, I wasn't ready to do that anymore. I know he loved her, but I wasn't going to sit around pretending that I was okay with it anymore, and she'd already proven that she wasn't worthy of being with anyone, let alone my dad. So I gave him an ultimatum and told him that he could either divorce my mother and never see her again, or else, I'd be the one going NC with him. He seemed kind of shocked because he clearly hadn't expected me to take this stance, but I couldn't stand my mother, and I don't think anyone in my place would have done things differently. She'd sent me to the hospital on my wedding day just so she could make a move on my husband. I mean, if that's not truly psychotic, then I don't know what is. My dad said that he needed to go back to the hotel and pack for his flight when I gave him the ultimatum, and didn't give me a proper answer at the time and hasn't spoken to me since. My husband and his family don't think I've done anything wrong because what my mom did was way out of line. It was disgusting and repulsive, and for my dad to even consider still staying with her after she tried to cheat on him with his son-in-law was just crazy. But I also don't want to lose my dad because he'd been my rock growing up, and he's literally the only family that I have. So it'll be really bad for me if he chooses to cut me off and stay with my mom instead. I don't know if what I did was right, and I don't know if it was my place to demand that my dad leave my mother because it is his life, after all. I could just stay in touch with him and not my mother, but I can't imagine that working. I feel like I'm being too hard on him because he's just gone through something just as bad as me, since it was his wife and the mother of his child who just tried to cheat on him, so he doesn't have it any easier than I do. So Ida, for giving my dad an ultimatum and asking him to pick between divorcing my mother or staying in touch with me? Update 1. Hi. So I talked to my dad after almost a week and well, he's still on the fence. I went through the comments on my post and realized that most of you believe that I should cut ties with my dad as well and shouldn't wait for him to leave my mom. As much as I would have loved to do that because it would have been a lot easier than facing this emotional roller coaster, I can't because I love my dad. Like I said earlier, I want to put myself first and stop talking to him, but my life would feel empty without him. I already practically don't have a mother because the one I do have, well, it's better to not have one than have her as my mom. And my dad and I have been close ever since I was a child, so it'll just be really difficult for me to cut him off and pretend to be okay with it. I wish I was as strong as everyone in the comments section is, but I'm really not, and things like these are just easier said than done, truth be told. There was also a particular section of people who believed that my husband had already cheated on me with my mother because of how comfortable she sounded while hitting on him, and thought that he didn't reciprocate only because he knew his mother was around. Well, as charming as that theory is, I don't think that's true at all. My husband and I are quite serious about each other and are very much in love. So for him to think about another woman, let alone my mom, is just really unlikely. I know I sound like I'm exaggerating or bragging, but it's just a fact. My husband is very loyal to me, and I don't appreciate the insinuation that he might have already been cheating on me, especially with my own mother. That's just disgusting. And since a lot of you asked why I hadn't called the cops on my mother when she triggered my allergies on purpose, the reason was that it was my wedding day, and police at a wedding is hardly ideal. I was already running late and I just didn't want that extra hassle and drama, so I told her to leave instead. She lives in a different state, so it's very unlikely that she'll be able to do anything to put me in harm's way after this, and if she does, I'll definitely call the cops, because then I won't be worrying about my guests or the 1,000 tasks I have to do before and after my ceremony. So yes, long story short, the reason I didn't call the police was because it was my wedding day. That was also the reason I let my florist off the hook, because the goof up actually wasn't her fault. She couldn't tell the difference between my mother's voice and mine, which was an honest mistake, and even after that, she did send me a text to confirm my order, but I never opened it. She didn't ask me again either, because she was busy with a lot of orders since she was handling a lot of weddings in a week. Like I said, I'm really forgetful, and I guess that was kind of on me. She did give me a discounted rate, though. As for my dad, I don't know what to say. I mean, he said that he's still thinking about what to do regarding the situation with my mother. He said that she apologized to him and said that she just got a little carried away. I don't know how that's an adequate defense for anything at all, but whatever, that's not even my concern. I don't care for her excuses, but apparently, my dad does. He told me that they've gone back to living separately and he's been contemplating what to do next. I don't understand what exactly he's contemplating, because I think there's a very clear and obvious solution to this problem: a divorce. That woman tried to cheat on him, for the love of God. I'm not going to tell him what to do, it should be his decision. But whatever he chooses to do, he'll have to face the consequences of his actions, and if he chooses to stay with my mom after what she did to me, then he'll have to lose me. And that's for sure. Update 2. Okay, I get it. I read the comments and I understand that I can apply the same logic that I used to defend my decision of not cutting ties with my dad to the situation that he's in. I get the irony, and I'm surprised I missed it the first time around. I guess I've been way too emotional, and that's why I didn't even realize that I was doing the exact same thing that I was calling out my dad for, defending him and continuing to condone his messed up behavior but refusing to cut him off. I know now that there's not much to do but just to let this go. I can't continue to think emotionally and let my heart run the show if I want peace of mind, and even my husband agrees that I need to let my family go because the way they've been acting is nothing short of crazy. My mom's insane and my dad's no less, because he's choosing to put up with that insanity quite willingly. He still hasn't been able to come to a decision about what he's going to do, and it's been more than 2 weeks. I think I've given him enough time to think about his decision, and if he still hasn't been able to come to a conclusion, then I have my answer. If he's not strong-willed enough to let my mom go now, then I doubt he ever will be. But I know that I have to cut him off for my own sake, and I'm going to do that now. Update 3. I did it. I called my dad up and told him that I couldn't, for my own sake, have him as a part of my life anymore. He was shocked when I said that and tried to tell me that he still hadn't reached a conclusion about what he wanted to do regarding the situation with my mom, but I told him that the fact that he was stalling me for so long meant that he was still willing to give her a chance, and I just couldn't accept that. He knew everything that my mother had done, and despite that, he was inclined towards choosing her. Had it not been for my ultimatum, he probably would have gotten back together with her already, and he didn't have a reply to that because he knew it was true. It was very difficult for me to bring myself to say it, but I did tell him that his parents, both of them, had let me down. My mother had done something unforgivable, and he was no better for letting her get away with it without almost any consequences. I could tell that he had a lot of things that he wanted to say, but he only said that he'd still be waiting for a text or a call from me whenever I was ready to forgive him, which meant that he was definitely going back to my mom. He said that he was sorry for whatever they'd put me through and hoped that I could forgive him someday, then disconnected the call. It was heartbreaking and I'm still not over it, but my husband is being really great, so I guess I'll come to terms with it soon enough. I just wish I'd called the cops on my mother that day and taught her a lesson, but I didn't, just to avoid the drama. I'm not gonna say I regret it, but I'll definitely keep praying that something terrible happens to that woman. She deserves the worst because she is the worst. My husband and I are supposed to leave for our honeymoon in a couple of days and I'm kind of sad right now, but I'm hoping that the trip will help me take my mind off of things.